Welcome. I'm Shelly O'Neal from the Green Velvet Couch, and I'm a therapist, a wellness coach, and certified corporate wellness specialist. On this podcast, I have the honor of talking to people who will be sharing their inspiring stories about how they've overcome obstacles to really live their life to the fullest. Hopefully, you'll leave the podcast being challenged, informed, and sharing a few laughs as we talk about hard things in a relaxing and fun manner. And as the owner of a 100-plus employee healthcare company, I know firsthand that corporate wellness is personal wellness. Welcome, everyone, to Conversations from the Green Velvet Couch. This is Shelly O'Neal, and I am here today with Dr. Elswick. We are super pumped to have him on board with us, and I can't wait to hear him talk about what he does in the field of addiction and recovery.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm always glad for a chance to talk addiction, drugs, drug policy, all of it. I talk about it so much to my partner that she's tired of it, and she's like, go do a podcast about it so you stop talking to me. So that's why I'm here, right? Mm-hmm. I actually have a lot of experience when it comes to this subject. So I started my professional career as a therapist. I was trained as a marriage and family therapist. I wanted to work with families who'd been impacted by addiction the way that my family had been impacted. And I enjoyed it. I've learned so much. My goodness, I don't need to tell you that the lifelong learning experience that is doing therapy, but I honestly don't think I was very good at it. And that's just the truth. I actually worked for a little bit in treatment, running groups, and I think there are a variety of reasons it just didn't suit me. And so the undergraduates I mentor now, I tell them all the time, you got to figure out what you don't want to do as much as what you do want to do. Mm-hmm. So I went back and got my doctorate. And so my research, I'm a professor today, assistant extension professor at the University of Kentucky. And my research focuses on long-term recovery. So kind of what are the ingredients in the recipe or the pieces of the puzzle, whatever analogy you like to put in place to sustain long-term recovery.
I love what you were saying about that you didn't feel like you were very good at therapy. And that's very refreshing to hear, because as a therapist, most of the time I hear people overinflate their skills versus I actually may not be so good at that. And I always tell people that the very first session that I conducted many, many moons ago, I went and threw up because I was so just nervous and didn't have any experience. So I love that you tell people they have to figure out what they're good at and what works for them. So you're now a professor with the UK Extension.
Mm-hmm. Yes. And I guess the last thing I'd mention is I'm also a co-founder of Voices of Hope. So we're a recovery community organization in Lexington. And that term, recovery community organization, we're a distinct entity from a treatment center. So we have about 108 staff, and all of them are people in recovery. And that's their main credential. They're not social workers. They're not clinicians. They're people in recovery who use that lived experience to build rapport and connect with others. So we really serve people who use drugs and people with substance use disorders in Lexington. And I do all of that because I'm a person in recovery.
So with Voices of Hope, what does that look like? More education, treatment? Kind of explain to me the mission and how like a day-to-day would look with Voices of Hope.
Yeah, it's a great question. It's a very cool model. So about 90% of folks with substance use disorders won't access treatment. So there's a huge treatment gap, and we really stand in that treatment gap. We really offer services for before folks go to treatment, for aftercare for folks who've already been to treatment, or for that large swath of our community who won't be able to access treatment. So the primary intervention in our brick and mortar location is peer-to-peer coaching to build assets to improve people's housing, their employment, their education, their relationships, their mental health, really a holistic kind of model. But some of the cool things we do, one is part of our ethos is that we really respect all pathways to recovery. We don't favor any one particular pathway of recovery over any other. And so we provide meeting spaces that you'll be familiar with, like 12-step programs, abstinence-based programs. But then we also offer some less traditional kinds of support groups like SMART recovery, which is based on cognitive behavioral principles, or MARA, Medication Assisted Recovery Anonymous, which is actually a dedicated space for folks on medication for opioid use disorder. So a variety of those kinds of things trying to meet different pathways to recovery.
Oh, to me, that's a very progressive mindset, because the experience I've seen is people can be like pro medication assisted treatment or not.
or it's only 12 steps. So in the past, I think that treatment in recovery has been incredibly rigid. Like there was one path and everyone needed to stay on it. So it sounds like to me what you're saying is different things work for different people. But I love that your organization that you co-founded actually fills in those gaps, because a lot of times people will do well in that treatment program, in that 30-day program. But then when they go back into their community and they're back around their old friends, their coworkers, their family, to maintain sobriety, I think it's more challenging than what we often portray. What are your thoughts on that?
I think you nailed it, and probably I can't say it any better than you just said it. I tell people often that we treat aftercare as an afterthought in our current treatment model, and that's a huge, tremendous mistake. We sort of treat getting someone to the doors of a treatment center like it's an end in and of itself. And while accessing treatment is a barrier to overcome, it's the beginning, not the end. A lot of my friends in the recovery space like to say that treatment is discovery and the recovery begins once you leave treatment.
Yes, I think you're really onto something, because there's almost a whew when you get that person admitted to treatment. I think the family and everyone involved kind of goes, whew, okay, my job is done now. They're going to be okay, or I'm done. When really treatment is just getting started.
Correct. And in the context of an opioid overdose epidemic, those stakes are raised even higher, because I'll hear people say frequently, well, I get my loved one to treatment, or when they're incarcerated, at least I know they're safe. And I don't mean to be the bearer of bad news, but it's really not accurate. I mean, first of all, people certainly have access to substances while they're incarcerated in most cases. But secondly, technically speaking, when someone goes to inpatient treatment, the likelihood that they'll experience a fatal overdose is increased, not decreased in the short term. So,
really,
of course, that's not to say that people shouldn't go to inpatient treatment. It's just a reality of the risk and a further evidence why just getting somebody to the doors of treatment surely isn't enough.
Mm-hmm. I want to ask you about two things, and then I want to move on to like harm reduction, because I know you're very passionate about that. But I want to talk a little bit about the shame and blame game that is just such a rock when it comes to recovery. I see like blame from parents, from spouses, and then I see so much shame within a family. And what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'd say you nailed it again. The research on stigma would connect it to blame. So essentially, the greater the perception that someone is to blame for the disorder, the more stigma that disorder carries. And so the World Health Organization did a study years ago, and it found that the single most stigmatized condition in the world is substance use disorder. And the fourth most stigmatized condition in the world is alcohol use disorder. So it's very much stigmatized. And the research would say, in my own experience, has shown that the better people understand addiction and recovery, the better they understand the science, the reality, that really goes a long way to destigmatizing it, to helping remove the blame, helping them understand that so much of this risk is genetic, so much of this risk is really outside of a person's control.
Mm-hmm. Yes. I think changing the way we view and we assign good and bad to substance abuse, and it's so much more complicated than that. So I think understanding it is just huge. And I think it's how you break those generational cycles as well. So tell me about your own recovery journey, and then take us down the path of what harm reduction is, what that means in recovery, and really help educate us.
Yeah, it's a great time for this question because it connects well to what we've been talking about with multiple pathways. The really short version of my addiction experience is first that I come from a really privileged background, and I'm always careful to start there because it bore so importantly on my addiction, but also my recovery. But I went to private school, live in the suburbs, had a really ideal childhood. When I have multiple co-occurring anxiety disorders. So starting about the age of 12 or 13, I started to experience symptoms of anxiety and didn't get them diagnosed until I was 22. So at my second treatment center, and I got 3 diagnoses actually: generalized anxiety disorder, social anxiety disorder, and trichotillomania, hair pulling disorder.
Yes.
When I was in 7th grade, I used to yank my eyebrows out. And so I started looking for ways to cope, and drugs and alcohol, it turns out, are a really effective solution in the short term.
Yes.
And, I think the biggest misconception about drug use is like, why would you use a drug and introduce something to your body that could potentially be harmful. But man, from the perspective of lived experience, when you're suffering and you want to make your suffering go away, drug use is so logical. It's so logical to just want to make your pain go away. Long story short, when I was 18 years old, I was prescribed opioids when I had wisdom teeth removed, and ended up getting a second prescription and got addicted to the opioids. And that led to heroin addiction and all the bad places that people go. It's probably not all that helpful to detail it all, but I went to, in and out of jail and on and off the street and in and out of treatment centers in exactly the way that we described, where I would do so well in treatment and get out and relapse, and then do well in treatment and get out and relapse. And I ended up homeless in Dayton, Ohio, actually sleeping under a bridge, and I was injecting heroin and panhandling. And I ended up walking into a Salvation Army, which is a homeless shelter there in Dayton, and spent 6 of the hardest months of my life, getting it all back together a little bit. And then I always tell people, I wish that I could say that's the end of the story. But the truth is, reintegrating was some of the most challenging part. And I had so much help coming from kind of just the privileged background that I did. I had help with housing, and I had help finding a job. And that job led to benefits, which led to health insurance, which allowed me to see a person like you who could help treat my anxiety. It's so having all those resources, what we in my field call recovery capital, really made a big difference in my ability to recover. And that's why we do a lot of what we do at Voices of Hope, because we recognize that only a small part of the work is done in treatment. And the vast majority of the living that you're going to have to do with this chronic disease of addiction, you're going to have to do out there in the world. You're going to have to figure out how to do that. And so then kind of connecting that to harm reduction, my recovery was 12-step based recovery, 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous primarily. And I don't have a negative thing to say about AA. I believe that it saved my life. There's so much wisdom and experience in those rooms. But, and a big but here, I was in 12-step recovery. My treatment center was 12-step recovery. Everyone that I built a relationship with immediately out of treatment was in 12-step recovery. So when I looked out into the world, onto the recovery horizon, so to speak, all I saw was 12-step recovery. And so I made that faulty assumption that so many people do, that is recovery, that recovery is abstinence, and it is abstinence through AA or a treatment center. And it turns out that I was quite a bit wrong about that. And that not only is abstinence not the most common pathway, it's actually kind of a minority pathway. And I was surprised to find that. What the research shows is the most common pathway of recovery is actually what's called natural recovery. It's just doing some terms now here. It's sometimes called spontaneous remission, but I really don't like that term because it's kind of misleading. Spontaneous remissions sounds like out of the blue, someone said, hey, I don't think I'll be addicted anymore, which of course isn't what's happening. But natural recovery really connects to recovery capital, all those resources I talked about having, because people who have a little more wherewithal are better able to recover without going to treatment, without seeing a therapist, without 12-step intervention, without any of those interventions. So that's interesting to note. And then I started looking at some of the literature on the medications, pharmacotherapies for opioid use disorder, and all these different pathways, people, non-abstinent pathways, people who continue to use substances as a part of their recovery, typically not their primary substance of use. Typically it's abstinence from a substance, but not always. And then that brought me to understand harm reduction as a pathway to recovery. So the first time that I was introduced to harm reduction, it was always framed as something that we did for people who couldn't become abstinent or like a last resort option. And it turns out harm reduction isn't that at all. Harm reduction's first principle starts by saying that drug use is a reality. And I love that because so many of our communities, the goal is to have drug-free communities. Every time I drive into Jessamine County, I pass a sign that says, this is a DARE drug-free community. And I say, no, it's not. I shot dope in that community. It's definitely not, right? That's kind of an erroneous goal because there never has been, never will be a drug-free society. That's not really, what we're opting for. So what harm reduction says is the reality is there are people who use drugs. You don't have to like it. You don't have to condone it, but you have to accept that reality so we can work from that reality. And so instead of saying, come back to us when you're ready to be abstinent, which is what most of the rest of the treatment model says, harm reduction says, let me engage with you right now. Even as you continue to use substances, let me build a rapport with you. Let me start to connect you with resources that are both going to mitigate the harms of your drug use, but also help you build a foundation for recovery, give you hope, give you an opportunity. And so it's been a whole new world for me, wading into harm reduction.
That's so encouraging and just eye-opening to hear you talk about that. One of the things as a therapist that we talk about is people may get to the point where they can stop drinking or stop using a substance, but that doesn't mean that they've addressed any of the emotional or mental health issues that they have, like anxiety or a mood disorder, just trauma. Lots of those things, they don't focus on those things. So they stop the use, but then they don't have any way or any intervention or strategies to actually go ahead and function well because these other things are still going on. I love that you mentioned that you had trichotillomania many moons ago. As a therapist, you'll have waves of clients. It's kind of like whatever you focus on and you do, your own research on, you tend to get more of those clients. So I ended up with a handful of trichotillomania patients, all children under age 18. And that's not something you see a lot. And I really learned a lot about, it being related to OCD and anxiety and just the relief that comes with that pulling or that removing of, an eyelash or hair or whatever. And using a very holistic approach and changing diet, like removing red dyes and yellow dyes, things that are found in a lot of the potato chips and drinks and things like that. That really helped that, that we saw some pretty immediate relief, but then addressing anxiety. But I remember thinking at the time, had those patients who were under 18 not been treated as they became older, how easy it would have been to self-medicate with alcohol or a substance.
That's so interesting that you tie those things together, because I just recently heard, I think on a podcast maybe, somebody tying together, kind of thinking about trichotillomania and substance use disorder in terms of process addictions. Just thinking about process addictions and thinking
that
about
compulsion.
Like you said, yes, and really thinking that in some ways addiction you can see it like OCD. You have this obsessive thought to use drugs, and the only way to relieve the obsession is with the compulsion of actually using it, which really fits the model really nicely. Yeah, and I used to tell people that I had recovered from my trichotillomania, but it's not the most honest thing. I started growing a little bit of facial hair at about 18, but it wasn't a substantial amount, right? When I probably turned 25, you know what I mean?
Yes, I do, yeah.
26, I started to actually grow some facial hair, and my trichotillomania came back with a vengeance, and it just had migrated from my eyebrows to picking beard hair, and it mirrors in a lot of ways my addiction, because they're both chronic disorders, and they're both these things that I'm going to carry with me for the rest of my life, and I have to find ways to manage on a daily basis. And so I'm interested to learn more about some of those nutritional interventions. I wasn't even familiar with those, but for me, I'll tell you a trick I tell people sometimes is, this is a wild one. I read it on the internet, a beard wax. And the reason that it works for me is because it changes like the tactile sensation of the hair. And so when I go to pull, for some reason, it's not as gratifying. And so I leave it alone. And so it's a really great solution.
Yeah, interesting. Because the people that I had worked with talked about the sensation of that itch and then that relief that you got from pulling. And I had folks who didn't have any eyelashes and pretty large spots, bald spots and different things. But yeah, they would talk about that actual sensation. So I love that. I'll have to share that with some other clients, but that's awesome to know. Yeah. One of the things I really enjoy about your approach is you're normalizing real life difficult situations. And I think we do, people, our children, our friends, our community, our patients, I think we do a disservice when we gloss over the way that life is supposed to be, when it's not very realistic. The fact is, coming from a privileged background, that didn't mean that your issues that you struggled with, like anxiety, were any less. It just means that you had more resources.
That's it. That's exactly it.
So I think, normalizing recovery and what recovery looks like after treatment is over, or, anything in life. And I always say that we are designed to do hard things. And I think
Hmm.
somewhere along the line, we maybe have forgotten that. But the human body and the human mind, if you look throughout history, we've accomplished and we've overcome almost inhumane things as cultures, as generations, as genders. So I love that you're normalizing that drug use, it is a reality. I'm like you, when I drive through those communities and it talks about, a certain program in the red t-shirts, I always want to smile and say, well, that makes a good entrance to a community, but it's not reality.
Right.
Let me ask you, was there a moment when you really felt like you tapped in to your own resiliency, and what helped that? What do you identify as being a resilient trait? Was there a moment or a person or a time period that you just kind of connected and said, I can do this?
Yes. And, I'm not a big believer in rock bottom, in the whole idea that people need to suffer so much that they'll change, because I've met so many people who have had every bad break in the world and suffered every which way, and that's not been enough to, you can imagine the guy who experiences chronic homelessness, who's been under the bridge 25 years. There's something really offensive about saying to him, when you've suffered enough, you'll be ready to recover, right? I mean, surely
Mm-hmm.
he needs other things. But at the risk of making this sound like a rock bottom story, when I was homeless in Dayton, I checked into the Salvation Army for about 3 days. And you have to do this thing called work therapy to earn your stay at the Salvation Army. And basically, you're processing the clothing donations. And your first job, you stand on hard concrete for 8 hours a day and you make piles of shirts and pants while you're withdrawing from heroin. It's a special kind of like abject misery. So 2 or 3 days in, I couldn't handle it and I walked out the front door. And I went and I was homeless a little while longer, and I had, I didn't hear the booming voice of God and I didn't see thunder or white lights, but I had a sort of a epiphany or moment of clarity or something. And the realization for me was that the only way out was through, which I realize is not maybe the most profound realization ever, but I think I was looking for every which way to not have to go through the suffering of the early recovery that I had to. And for me, and I don't know that this is necessary for everyone, but for me, I came face to face with the reality that I was going to have to go through the suffering and it was going to be rough. And I just decided there was ultimately no other way. And so that allowed me to commit at least a little bit more, but just so that I don't glorify my own story too much, I tried to quit about 12 times after that. The first 30 days, I tried to leave every day. I cried, I begged, I pleaded, and I just fortunately had a lot of people around me telling me to kind of shut up and sit out.
Mm-hmm. Really just making that decision, then just I'm going to have to get through this, was probably something that was really something you can look back on. And when you spend a lot of time avoiding that and self-medicating, then to make that decision to just face it. And I always tell patients that it's like eating a pizza. Pizza is one of my top 3 foods. I can eat a lot of pizza. I can't put the whole pizza in my mouth at one time, but give me slice after slice and I'll go with you, pound for pound for any man. And I think that, life is like that. Like, it's overwhelming if you and I think today, all the things that we have to do tomorrow and the next day and this month and then summer and then the holidays. I was at a retail store over the weekend and they already have all the fall stuff out. And I'm like, give me a minute here. But I think that if you look at recovery or addressing any mental health issue, it is a slice at a time. You can't fix everything. You're not equipped, you're not regulated enough. So it really is like a piece of pizza, and then you look up and you've eaten half of it, and then life's better, and then the whole thing and life doesn't even look like it did, a few months ago. So I guess that's what I want to encourage people that might be listening, is to say that today, it's just today and it's one slice at a time. But thinking you've got to do all those things, it makes you want to go back to bed or wherever you're at and pull the covers up and never ever get up, because it's too overwhelming.
Yes. Yeah. And relatedly, one of the greatest gifts that anybody ever gave me in recovery was a counselor named Jeff at a place called Stillwaters in Nashville. Taught me, in a sense, in as much as you can, taught me meditation, and would sit and meditate with me and encouraged me to meditate with another guy. I would get up early. I'd get up at 5:30 to meet with this guy named Jeremy, and we would meditate 45 minutes in the morning, right? And he really sold me on the value and he knew that I'm a science guy, so he sold me on the science of it. And I am here to tell you that I am a faithful meditation practitioner. And I think, not picking on anybody, I think a lot of people talk about it. I'm not sure how many people dedicate time to practice. I'm telling you, it's a part of my day every single day. And I relate it to the idea of a slice at a time or a day at a time, because that kind of mindfulness helps me to stay in this moment. And always I can handle what's in this moment. Somebody told me once, probably a therapist, that I have 100% success rate in getting through hard things in my life. And I love that because he's right. And it's true for all of us. But yeah,
that's huge. Yeah. That's just huge, that statement that you made. So when you first started meditating, how long did it take you to feel better? I always say that, I was a single mom for many years, and I'm super practical as a therapist. Like, everything needed to work yesterday, and was it going to be something that I could invest in and it contribute to my life? So how long before meditation started contributing to your life? And I'm saying this for the people out there who are maybe toying with the idea of doing it or starting a meditation practice.
Yes, and that's a great way to frame it, because I'm the same way. I'm not going to do something just to do it. I want to know that I'm getting benefit. Otherwise, I've got better things to do with my time. So the first thing I would say is there are acute benefits. There are immediate benefits. So research would show this, and you can also experience this. 15 minutes of meditation, you're going to experience your blood pressure reduced, your heart rate gone down, your respiration slowed, cortisol levels lower. For a lot of reasons, already immediately you're getting benefits. But what the research would show with consistent practice, most of the recommendations are somewhere between 20 and 40 minutes a day. So it doesn't have to be a whole lot. 2, 10 or 20-minute sessions is sufficient. And one thing that's cool in the research is consistent meditation practice actually shrinks the size of your amygdala. Like, measurably, we can measure this. And your amygdala is your fear center. So it is measurably and observably shrinking your fear of the world. And for a person like me, who in my anxiety, I experience fear over so many things, that's powerful. And it's powerful for me to see that in the research and then go get to experience it when I practice it. The other thing I'd say is, in my experience, people who would benefit from meditation the most tend to be initially the most resistant to it, because if you have ADHD, if you have anxiety disorders, those voices bark so loud, it's really hard to sit still. I tried to perfect meditation for a long time. I want to do it right. I was so obsessed with doing it right until I really came to internalize that it's more just about doing it and really letting go. And I think just like anything else you practice, you get better at it over time. A colleague of mine says, everybody should meditate for 30 minutes a day. And if you don't have time, then you should meditate for an hour. And I love that.
Exactly. I have several patients that have been doing online meditation and just different things. And I know it works, but it's a little shocking to see people get better, to see their anxiety decrease pretty rapidly. They'll track their moods, their blood pressure, pulse rate, that sort of thing, and to see the sleep improve. I mean, it's actually staggering how well it just, and it's not anything new. I mean, it's like centuries old, and here we are going, wow, this actually works, which I think is kind of funny. And I know that in Colorado, there's a lot of studies in the school when they do yoga and meditation with children on a regular basis, that the behavioral issues decrease significantly, which I think is really interesting. There's some really cool studies coming out of the state.
A mindful response to behavioral problem. It just makes sense, doesn't it?
Yeah, it does. And then you're exactly right. Then you go into more of a mindful state. And I was working with a group the other day, and we were talking about what mindfulness really is. And I said, well, this was a manufacturing industry. And one of the things we discussed was mindfulness is about decreasing your risk for injuries and different things. Like when you're mindful, you're in the moment, you're aware of your surroundings, you're less likely to make a mistake that will hurt you, whether it's a parenting issue or, you're employed. So I think that mindfulness it's more than feeling good. It's really about safety as well.
It is. And there are so many benefits. I think, a lot of what we talk about with mindfulness is putting a second between stimulus and response. is trying to put a second in there so that you're responding rather than reacting. And I experience that in my day to day. And it's not one to one. So it's not like if I meditate this morning, then I have a perfect day. And if I don't meditate, it's not that simple. But during the pandemic, my mental health went kind of in a bad direction. And I didn't realize until a couple weeks later, kind of in retrospect, that my meditation practice had been slowly kind of going away. And I've been skipping days, and I do think they're related. I'm sure it wasn't solely responsible for it, but I'm pretty confident that they're related. And a big believer in meditation, and honestly, exercise as well. And I know it's annoying. Some people just don't want to hear that, but the research on meditation and exercise, the acute and chronic benefits, is a long, ridiculous list. And it doesn't have to be anything epic. You don't have to run a marathon, and you don't have to become a monk. You can meditate 20 minutes a day. You can go for a walk in the sunshine. It helps you.
Exactly. And stimulating those dopamine levels in your brain from exercise versus using a substance, and then, strengthening your immune system. Just there's so many benefits to exercise from a mental health perspective. Dr. Ballou was on our podcast, and one of the things she spoke about was collective suffering. And I love how we talked about like treatment, and when you go through something really difficult or traumatic, and you go through it with a support system or other people who are dealing with something, there's something very powerful about that collective suffering. And then during COVID, what we saw was increased isolation, and people lost all of that. So, we use the term social support and support system, and we throw it around like it's just whatever. But the fact is, that's really key. Your tribe, your group of healthy people, that's key to recovery, and it's key to higher functioning in your daily life, and just overall functioning and performance, and feeling content and happy.
Well, and another way to connect them is through the brain science, connecting exercise and social support. So, in simplest terms, what addiction does to the brain is it downregulates dopamine. Dopamine goes down, 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 down. So the research on ways to expedite upregulation, basically expedite healing of the addicted brain, exercise upregulates dopamine, and pro-social interaction upregulates dopamine. So it's like not surprising that you all would have that discussion, and that those things would be connected. They quite, not only is social support giving you some tangible benefits, maybe somebody can give you a ride to an appointment. Not only are you getting emotional benefits because you're getting that kind of support, but you're actually getting neurological benefits because it's actually expediting the healing of your brain, which is pretty darn cool.
That's a great point. Well, let me just ask you one more thing before we wrap up. If someone is facing a hard moment, a hard relationship, a tough decision right now, whether it's related to recovery or mental health, what would you want them to remember? What would you like for them to know? And because a lot of our podcast is about just motivating, inspiring, and encouraging people.
I would say, in my experience, when I start suffering, the world gets really, really small for me. All of a sudden, I lose perspective, and I don't make good decisions when I'm under duress. And I think that's human nature, but I've also learned this about myself in particular. So when I'm having a hard moment, when I'm in a place like that, I have to pause. I have to do something a little bit mindful, not necessarily meditate, but take a moment. Maybe it means call a friend and bounce some of the situation off of somebody else. I just know that the way that I view things, when my cortisol levels are up and my fight or flight response is engaged, it looks very different. Sometimes 2 days later, sometimes 2 hours later, it all looks very different. And so sometimes it's about not making a mountain out of a molehill in the moment, and finding a way to just kind of slow down and take it as it is.
That's great advice, I think, for anyone that's going through something difficult. I love how you said that, your world gets very small. And the fact is, when we talk about depression and anxiety, our body actually will go inward. Our feet will turn in, our posture will slump over. We will get kind of like in a ball, closer and closer and closer to the ground. So when we're reading body language, it's really interesting to see people, how well they're feeling based on like their openness of their body and how they're sitting and talking and being relaxed. So it literally gets small, and figuratively as well.
Very good point. Absolutely.
So I think that's great advice. Well, thank you very, very much for being on our podcast today. I think it's just so valuable what you've had to say. And I love how you shared your experience, but you're very humble and very gracious, and you're not glorifying the tough times, but you're also normalizing difficult situations. And I think that alone needs to be just really promoted to people, that tough times are a part of life and you are going to get through them. And how are we going to do that? So I think
Yes.
that's just huge. And I love the work that you're doing with Voices for Hope.
Thanks for having me on.
Thanks so much for listening to Shelly O'Neal from the Green Velvet Couch. If you're enjoying the show, please rate, subscribe, and review where you listen to your podcast. That helps others find the show and begin their own wellness journey. Thanks again for tuning in. Until next time, go live your best life.